For the next part of this lecture, we will talk about individuals' behavior when they are in group settings. One of the first phenomena that we will talk about is referred to social facilitation, and this refers to the phenomenon by which individuals who are in a group and there is the possibility that they can be evaluated and are in the presence of others. They need not just be being observed, even though that's possible. They could just be around someone, like you're in a room full of people. And the idea here is that when you are in the presence of other people and your evaluation can be linked to you, the person will tend to do better on simple tasks and they will tend to do worse on complex or novel tasks. Now, one thing that's very intriguing, I think personally, is that this phenomenon will actually also happen even in the presence of pictures or posters of famous people that we admire. And so if you have one of them up on a wall next to you, this will oftentimes lead to the same type of social facilitation effects, though it is unclear why exactly that happens. Another important thing to remember is the degree of training also makes a big difference. So if you are not very trained on a task, it is novel to you, then the presence of other people will impair your performance. Though if you are well trained or well prepared on a task, then the presence of other people will actually improve your performance. This is thought to be due to arousal in the body. And so it has been shown in quite a bit of different literatures that heightened levels of arousal, or just sort of when our physiological system is highly activated, that we tend to perform simple and well-trained behaviors quite well, but we tend to show dramatic impairment in performing novel or complex behaviors. And so ultimately it is thought that the presence of other people ultimately elicits a degree of arousal in us, and this results in the social facilitation effects we have seen. And so it's also well documented that the presence of others does lead to an increase in arousal, but there are some competing theories as to why this might be the case. So the first of these is that the presence of others they cause us to be much more alert because other people are unpredictable, the same way as other creatures are unpredictable, because at the end of the day, you can't quite know what they're going to do. And this is oftentimes even amongst individuals why it can make such a big difference, that strangers oftentimes cause much more anxiety because their behavior patterns are unknown, while people we are comfortable with, one of the reasons we are comfortable with them is we tend to know their behavior patterns. So the idea here is just that the presence of other people, there's always the possibility that they might ask you something, do something that will require you to respond in some way, and always trying to be prepared for that leads to a degree of arousal, and that arousal then affects our performance. Now, another theory is referred to as evaluation apprehension, and this is the idea that we are always susceptible to the idea of other people evaluating our performance, and this causes us to feel a mild degree of anxiety, and that anxiety leads to arousal. Now, this is plausible for humans, but social facilitation has been shown to affect non-humans as well, and this is not an explanation that works very well as soon as you move away from the human class of animal, because as far as we know, many creatures, including some of the insects on which this has been shown to affect, are probably not thinking very much about how other insects would evaluate them. The third theory of how arousal might arise in the presence of other people is just due to distraction. And this is very similar to the first one, where we're just more alert due to their unpredictable nature. And so the idea here of distraction is just that ultimately people are distracting for a multitude of reasons. Everything from they're fun to look at to they make irritating sounds. And all of these things ultimately can distract us, and this distraction leads to a mild state of arousal, which again affects our performance. In line with this theory, the idea of other non-human entities or things, even inanimate objects that could be distracting to us, could lead to social facilitation, and research actually does bear this out. So something like a phone notification on your table while you're trying to perform some task will oftentimes lead to the same type of social facilitation effects, making it easy for you to do simple tasks that you know well, but making you do worse on more complex or novel tasks that you're not well trained at. Now, while there is other evidence to support this idea, ultimately it could be a combination of these three theories that are ultimately at play in any given individual's heightened state of arousal when they are in the presence of other people, and that leading then to effects on our performance. The opposite, really, of social facilitation is referred to as social loafing, and this refers to the idea that when people are in groups and individual members cannot be evaluated on an individual basis, that they will tend to perform worse on simple tasks and better on more complex tasks. And so the idea here is that on simple tasks, people don't really care as much, and no one will ever know that they're actually being evaluated, and so they don't actually have to try that hard. This is very common in university classes when professors assign people to do group work. Oftentimes, only a few members of each group will actually do much work, and many of them will tend to sort of punch out, chat about their lives, or play around on social media or some such. You see the same thing when people are clapping in a wide group, where not everybody claps to the fullest, and since no one can ever know who really clapped a lot and who didn't, people tend to get away with it. Yet, conversely, when you have a group of individual members and an individual cannot be identified in terms of their performance, people tend to do better on complex tasks. And so this is again linked to the idea of arousal. If I'm working with a group of people all towards the same end and the whole group is working together, and while I might not know a certain component, all of us together are likely going to be able to solve the various difficulties that arise, and because no individual will actually be evaluated, this reduces our overall level of arousal. And by reducing the overall level of arousal, it makes us more able to deal with highly demanding cognitive tasks, especially complex ones that require either abstract knowledge or the combination of many disparate ideas. And this is the same for novel or difficult tasks as well, where this sort of lowering rate of arousal will tend to help us perform better. So this is what one sees also when taking exams, for example. While you don't want to have no arousal because then you'd likely be asleep, but having a high degree of arousal, like anxiety, for example, tends to impair our performance on exams because it inhibits the ability for our higher level cognitive tasks to function, because we're then much more primed to live in a state where we're looking for lions or other dangerous items that could have evolutionarily targeted us, whereas when our arousal is low, we can tend to think more of novel ways of solving problems. There are some differences in social loafing across both gender and culture. Literature has shown pretty reliably, actually, that when it comes to social loafing, that men are much more common to engage in this behavior than women. And this is thought to be largely due to women consistently rating higher in relational interdependence than men. Relational interdependence just means that they are much more focused on the interrelational dynamics between members of a group and maintaining sort of these relational dynamics between a group and minimizing conflict among them, whereas men show this trait much less. Now, this is not thought to be a biological difference, but rather a result of the way both men and women are socialized and the different sort of social norms and rules that are applied to members of either gender. One sees again a similar tendency for social loafing to be much stronger in Western and individualistic cultures as compared to Eastern and collectivist cultures. And again, the mechanism is thought to be largely the same. That in Western cultures, the focus tends to be on the individual, and because the individual is looking out much more for themselves, they're able to get away with not doing work because they perceive that others will take care of it in this case, and since they're not going to get credit or be penalized for it, why bother engaging? Whereas in Eastern cultures, there's much higher emphasis placed on the group overall as opposed to the individual, and so it would generally be disgraceful to the group to not contribute, at least to some degree. This is not to say that there is no social loafing amongst women or in Eastern cultures, just that the tendency for this phenomena is less amongst women than men, and it is less in Eastern cultures than Western cultures. And again, remember, Western is just really referring to, I guess, the United States of America and Europe. Much of South America, even though in the Western Hemisphere, actually qualifies much more in the collectivist cultures than individualistic cultures. Finally, there's de-individuation. This refers to the loosening of normal constraints on behavior when people cannot be identified, such as when they are in a group. And this is especially likely when not only are the members not actually able to be identified, but when they at least believe that they cannot be identified. In both cases, you will tend to see this phenomenon happen. And so what tends to happen here is that people feel much less accountable because they believe that no one can identify single members of the group, and so they could get away with things. And when they are in this type of state, they actually stop thinking so much as individuals, and the whole group starts to think much more collectively. And at the end of the day, this can lead to some pretty violent and heinous behaviors. A lot of various racial-based aggressions that have taken place over the years, a lot of lynchings that have taken place, a lot of attacks on holy places that have taken place, a lot of targeting of minorities that have taken place, oftentimes happens when a crowd reaches a fervor, and ultimately you find that members in the crowd tend to de-individuate, where they're no longer thinking individually and are just sort of following along with the group is not quite right. They're exacerbating much of the norms of the groups themselves. And in the next lecture slide, I believe we'll talk about group polarization, which we'll see much more of how this works. Now, it should be noted that this doesn't always lead to violent behaviors. It leads to an exacerbation of the group norms. So, for example, if the group, just the norm is to play lots of board games on Tuesdays, and now everybody is just kind of wearing masks, I guess, and no one can tell who's who, and if other people are moving through the apartment, people will just play even more board games, right? It doesn't have to be violent. Even though a lot of times when we talk about de-individuation, it tends to be around violent behaviors of groups, and this is just because that's where we study it, where it happens to be very detrimental. When this happens with a group of individuals in a non-violent situation, we tend to pay much less attention because they're not actually doing harm to anybody. Again, or additionally, I suppose, that people, when they de-individuate and become sort of amalgamated with this crowd or group, they will tend to overwrite or overlook society's norms and follow much more closely group norms. So, for example, if a group has the norm that a certain class of people are subhuman or less worthy of care and treatment, even though society as a whole has the norm that all people should be treated equally, when de-individuation occurs, people are much more likely to follow this bigoted group norm than the egalitarian norm of society. One last topic related to de-individuation is in online behavior. So many people are aware, especially in today's age, that people will say things on online forums and formats that they would not say in person. There are things people will say in a chat group that they would never say at a bar. And one of the large reasons for this is, again, because of de-individuation and an exacerbation of existing prejudices and norms that a person might hold. Because in an online format, it is very difficult to actually identify the individual who is truly making these statements, people feel much more comfortable expressing more extreme views than even they themselves might originally hold. While maybe you could call these deep-seated beliefs, the idea here is that no one can truly really know, and it could be either they're just unfiltered in what they're talking about, or because they feel more licensed to express themselves, that expression of more and more extreme views tends to internalize those extreme views and make them more extreme. But again, because people are behind walls and anonymous postings, this tends to lead to ultimately what we in today's world call trolls.